Hello, brothers and sisters. It's kind of reaching the end of a crazy week. If you look over towards the Ring of Fire area, we've seen the volcanoes destroy a good chunk of the Big Island. We've seen earthquakes literally growing around here. We've seen earthquakes kind of on spot around these drilling areas. And it comes to the point where, in full disclosure, I'm trying to wake people up here. So, in my own way, I'm just going to look at a geopolitical map so you guys can understand that a lot of times when people look at AntiChrist, they focus on Rome or they focus on US, but a lot doesn't really focus on just us. So let's go into the geopolitical situation right now. In the US here, we've got Donald Trump, and he's isolating. He's starting trade issues with Canada, he's starting trade issues with Mexico. He's going over the seas here, and he's basically saying, you treat us fair, you've taken advantage of us for a long time. And he's changing the Western rhetoric. For a lot of times we were charitable. And now he's saying, it's time to pay up because we're going in debt and this can't work. Now, what he also did is over here in the Middle East, he made the capital of Israel Jerusalem. And he's moved it's the embassy over there. And the European bloc is not very happy with it. But the European bloc is splitting of itself. So now Donald Trump is disintegrating here and disintegrating everything being combined. You've got Latin America, who in general has a tendency to side with America on the views over here. And then you have everything else. So for people who think of American Antichrist, the problem is we make up 5% of the world, and most of the rest of the world doesn't really like us. All right, they just don't like us. They don't like our values. They don't like our politics. So in this strip right here, and I'll just call it the strip right here, this is predominantly a Muslim area. It makes up roughly 1/3 of the world's population. Up here, it's pseudo-Christians and a hybrid. Over here, you've kind of got the Taoist and the Hindu and all the other religions. Down here, Africa's Christian and lawlessness in its own sense. Latin America, it's Christian and lawlessness for the most part. And up here you have kind of your Christian areas, but kind of the demoralization's gone this direction. Just like the demoralization in the world kind of came this direction, kind of like a sea through all of the Christian nations. But the harsh reality is, and I'm waiting for my iPad to reload, most of the map here doesn't like us. And sexual tendencies and pornography and other stuff is prevalent over here too. You have nude beaches all over here. You have sexual promiscuity, single parents, everything else. It didn't come from America, it just was part of it. You have genocide, you have rape, you have torture culture. This is all prevalent here. It's not part of American culture. You have Muslims in their areas over here. You've got the Chinese in their areas over here. I mean, you can find the same moral degradation that you hear of in America. So a lot of the concepts around America being the central, it's not quite there. Here's what I see happening. We're all split on where we see everything in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was going to be a burdensome stone. Now what the real battle is you've got Israel versus Palestine. You've got the human rights advocates who think that everything should be given to them, and whether they paid into a system or not. And then you've got the conservative right, where you've got people who think that they can shoot and self-defend and, keep law and order. And that's the love and law that I've been talking about since the beginning video. But what we see is the geopolitics switching. I'm going to flip to a couple articles here just to show you I'm not crazy in what I've been talking about for 3 years. So, in Turkey, which is what I call the King of the North, he says he'll lift the state of emergency after the 24th elections, which means he thinks the Kurdish state and all this other stuff that he's been fighting against can be gone within a couple of weeks, and it'll be done with his presidency, and it is what it is. Then we start seeing on the Iran nuclear accord, they are turning east. They've lost hope with dealing with Europe. Europe's been trying to negotiate a different deal, obviously with Donald Trump and everybody. The deal was horrible to begin with, but they were going to develop nuclear weapons either way, so delaying the inevitable doesn't really do anything. And Europe is now against us. So what we're seeing is the G7 is dividing into the G6 plus Trump over the trade war threats. So we're now moving into an isolation standpoint. We're not moving into a powerful world government standpoint. We are moving into isolation. Then you've got Russia, our counterpart, telling Europe about the U.S. trade war threat. I told you so. You know, eventually it's all about the U.S. imposing its rules on others, and now we're paying the price for ignoring them. So when you start thinking about the ideologies of different people, you'll understand that the foundations are different. The way that everybody defines truth is based on their culture. It's also based upon what they value and what they stand by. So what I call as truth is the scripture. I stand by Jesus' words, what the prophet said, and how everything unfolded in history. But what I also know is that it's not going to be centric to money in the U.S. It's not going to be central to the Europeans and the Pope. The Pope doesn't have enough control over his billion-plus subscribers across the world. If he said enact a war against everybody, you'd probably have 20% of the Catholic Church, 10%? A very limited number. The ones that scare me come back to the map here, and this comes down to eschatological views, is this Muslim strip right here. These guys are looking for what is referred to as a Mahdi. The Mahdi is basically the Christian version of an AntiChrist. They're looking for one world ruler to basically unite the world in Islam and basically create the Islamic world that would basically be enforced by Sharia law, changing of law in time. So you'll get that from Scripture. The Pope's not trying to do that. Changing Sunday doesn't do that. Eating meat doesn't do that. Not following the biblical passages in the past doesn't do that. Islam does. The Europeans can't even get along with each other. You've got some of these blocs trying to work with each other, but UK Brexited. France can barely control its rural population. You got the rurals versus the Muslims. And most of these nations actually have a lot of Muslims in them. It wouldn't be hard for Turkey to let down its guard, flip this whole area full of Muslims, and basically take it over by Jihad. That's pretty simple. And if you get somebody in this area who can unite the Sunnis all around here with the Shiites over here, blending it on an oil, which is probably the monetary point that it's going to go, you can swing in Russia and China, because all they want to do is grow their economies. They don't really care about religion. Then you have the Western bloc here, who's going to want the oil, but they're not going to want to pay for it. And then you've got Africa. Africa's kind of the sad nations where I don't really see much noise coming out of. But again, when you're looking at Middle East prophecy, the whole point was look to the north and look to the east. Those were the reports getting in trouble. So I would imagine that Russia and China, especially since they're doing a lot of bilateral talks, will team up to fight what I would call the restored Ottoman Empire. Now, these things are all forming. They're forming pretty rapidly, and they're all based on a handful of contingent variables. But it seems like everything happens, and it's just like with Turkey's Erdogan. You've got the mainstream news saying that he might lose the first round of the elections, or he won't absolutely win it in the first round of elections. But I point to, look at Donald Trump. He was a landslide victory, or he was a landslide loss to Hillary, and then when the time came, the people did a landslide victory towards him because he stood against everything that the media tells you. The problem with the media is people want to dictate what you do in your life, right? That's their version of truth. Again, my version of truth, God and Christ went there and they wanted to create a kingdom of love and sacrifice. I mean, it's shown through Christ. And he defeated all the armies. And the problem is when we start looking at these self-fulfilling ideologies where we focus on money being the issue or everything else, we'll confuse people with the truth of the matter. None of us are capable of being in God's presence. It's only through Christ that we've been made whole. And by doing that, we can recognize the truth. We're fallen creations united through Christ. All of the ideologies you find on this wonderful world map, they're all BS. They're lies that Satan spread through our own minds, through our own, basically, maturations. We've lied to each other. You know, we've got what we call the freest world over here, which is pretty money-centric. You've got Europe, who's, you know, it's in its own special world. You've got pretty bad situations in Africa. You got totalitarianism over here. So you've got basically rulers of one in kingdoms over here. We're starting to move that way over here. And again, nobody's agreeing with anybody else. Everybody thinks they're the victim. Everybody thinks they're the person who should have more. And what happens in those situations is failure. Again, when you look at the different theories where you can start going through socialism or anything else, you still need somebody over the top to make sure that somebody's not taking advantage of the other person. And the only person who can do that is God. But we all like to think that something else will happen. I don't see anyone from Israel being the Antichrist. I think they're going to get a nice humbling block when the time comes. I don't think it's Trump. I think we're going to go to an isolationist type environment, and it's going to be liberals and conservatives fighting against each other. It's just going to be mayhem in the U.S. Canada's going to be so detached, and they're already pretty much a big city type country. Latin America's already got its problems, so there's not much to do there. The mystery of lawlessness is pretty present. Africa, mystery of lawlessness is pretty present. Australia's got to figure out what it's got to do because they've got a population similar to the U.S. But again, I think it all stems from the heart of the world here, and it's going to rotate through everybody. You know, do you side with the Palestinian who's throwing tear gas and think his land was stolen? Or do you side with Israel, who believes it's biblically scripted land and they have the right to pursue order? I mean, for me, none of these things really matter. It just matters that Christ died for my sins, and can't wait to greet him and the Father and take my judgment and go into eternity. So, love you all. Time's coming. Bye.